How could the Christian church ever come into existence as a result of the disheartened, frightened, skeptical apostles? Only the resurrection of Christ from the dead can account for motivating the disciples to give their lives to preach about Christ and nurture the Christian church Christ had founded. It can hardly be overestimated how devastating the crucifixion was to the apostles. They had sacrificed everything for Jesus, including their jobs, their homes, and their families.
Then Peter said in reply, "See, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have?"
Everything of value was pinned squarely on Jesus, all their hopes, their entire lives, everything. But now he was dead, branded a criminal. The apostles were dejected and depressed in their knowledge that Christ was not their expected Messiah.
"But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened."
They were hardly subject to visions and hallucinations in such a condition. As we have just seen, they rejected the first reports of Jesus' resurrection. It was only after Jesus appeared to them again and again, talking with them, encouraging them to touch him to see that he had a physical body, showing them the wounds in his hands and his side, that they became convinced.
When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord.
So these were not men ready to believe. The very fact that Jesus rebuked them for their unbelief indicates that Thomas was not the only one who was a hard-headed skeptic. At one time or another, Jesus rebuked all of the 11 apostles for their unbelief in his resurrection.
And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself." And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts?" And while they still disbelieved for joy and were marveling, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them, although the doors were locked. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, and see my hands, and put out your hand, and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe."
This proves they were convinced against their will. If they had expected a resurrection, they would have been waiting for it. But they weren't and needed a lot of convincing when it happened. 40 days worth.
He presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God.
The record is clear that none of the disciples understood the necessity of the resurrection. This is seen both from Peter's rebuke of Jesus when he predicted his death and resurrection.
From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you."
And from when Jesus predicted his resurrection after his transfiguration. Mark says of the disciples,
"But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him."
Thus, the disciples not only didn't believe in the resurrection, they didn't even understand the concept. After Jesus spoke of his rising from the dead in Mark 9 verse 9,
So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean.
on another occasion when Jesus spoke of his resurrection, it was recorded of the disciples.
But they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said.
So, how do we account for their belief in something that was completely unexpected? As Michael Green comments,
it is clear from all the accounts that the disciples were utterly disheartened men. They were anxious only to run away, hide, and forget all about the whole affair. They had been on a wild goose chase in following Jesus of Nazareth, and the crucifixion had dashed all their hopes. They had no thought of carrying on his cause. Resurrection never entered their heads.
in light of all of this, then how do we account for the beginning and spreading of the church? William Lane Craig discusses how a mysterious something must be proposed to account for it.
It is quite clear that without the belief in the resurrection, the Christian faith could not have come into being. The disciples would have remained crushed and defeated men. Even had they continued to remember Jesus as their beloved teacher, his crucifixion would have forever silenced any hopes of his being the Messiah. The cross would have remained the sad and shameful end to his career. The origin of Christianity therefore hinges on the belief of the early disciples that God had raised Jesus from the dead.
Now the question becomes, what caused that belief? As Reginald H. of Full Air says, even the most skeptical critic must presuppose some mysterious X to get the movement going. But what was that X? Clearly, it would not be the result of Christian influences, for at that time there was no Christianity. But neither can belief in the resurrection be explained as a result of Jewish influences. The Jewish conception of resurrection differed in two important, fundamental respects from Jesus' resurrection. In Jewish thought, the resurrection always, 1. Occurred after the end of the world, not within history, and 2. Concerned all the people, not just an isolated individual. In contradistinction to this, Jesus' resurrection was both within history and of one person. The disciples, therefore, confronted with Jesus' crucifixion and death, would only have looked forward to the resurrection at the final day, and would probably have carefully kept their master's tomb as a shrine, where his bones could reside until the resurrection. In other words, the disciples' belief in the resurrection of Christ cannot be explained as a result of either non-existent Christian belief or Jewish teaching. There is simply no way to explain the origin of such belief concerning Christ's resurrection apart from the fact that it happened. This is why secular historians, who study the events surrounding the origin of the church, are mystified if they reject the resurrection of Christ. The task of the historian is to adequately account for events that occur. No one doubts the church exists. But the historian cannot adequately account for it apart from the resurrection. The problem for the secularist who discounts the resurrection is that the mysterious X is still missing. According to Charles Francis Digby Mole of Cambridge University, here is a belief nothing in terms of previous historical influences can account for. He points out that we have a situation in which a large number of people held firmly to this belief, which cannot be explained in terms of the Old Testament or the Pharisees, and that these people held on to this belief until the Jews finally threw them out of the synagogue. According to Professor Mole, the origin of this belief must have been the fact that Jesus really did rise from the dead.
If the coming into existence of the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole of the size and shape of the resurrection, what does the secular historian propose to stop it up with? The birth and rapid rise of the Christian church remain an unsolved enigma for any historian who refuses to take seriously the only explanation offered by the church itself. The resurrection of Jesus is therefore the best explanation for the origin of the Christian faith.
Now, in light of all this, let us ask the reader a question. Given the disciples' initial skepticism and lack of understanding, given the inability of all history to adequately explain the existence of the Christian church apart from the actual resurrection of Christ, how do you account for churches on every street corner of the country and throughout most of the entire planet? Can we really believe the mental frame of mind of the disciples, prior to the resurrection appearances, was sufficient to invent the church? Could the unbelieving and skeptical disciples have proclaimed a resurrection, the proclamation alone of which began the Christian church, when they never expected it in the first place? As Johannes Norvald Geldenhuys observes,
it is historically and psychologically impossible that the followers of Jesus, who at his crucifixion were so completely despondent and perplexed, would within a few weeks thereafter enter the world, as they did, with such unheard of joy, power, and devotion, if it had not been for the fact that he had risen from the dead, had appeared to them, and had proved that his claims to be the Son of God were genuine.
Consider just a few additional questions. Every book of the New Testament is based upon the conviction that Christ rose from the dead. If he never did, how were those 27 books ever written? Why would the apostles face the hostility and persecution of the Jewish leaders by attempting to found a new movement based on the teachings of a condemned criminal? Why would they continue to follow and speak about a man who was obviously a fraud, or worse, in that he made predictions about his resurrection that never came true? On what basis would the apostles proclaim this same dead person, who did not resurrect, as God, when their entire religious training had taught them it was blasphemous to call a man God?
This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. The Jews answered him, "It is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God."
In other words, what would cause devout Jews to widely preach absolute blasphemies, which went against the entire grain of their personal convictions unless it were the resurrection?